Welcome to Gospel Conversation Ordinary Sunday 32, Matthew 25, and very tricky little passage that 10 bridesmaids, but Anne very cleverly has some background. First of all, welcome Anne in Dunedin, or Carey's Bay. Welcome Jonathan from Auckland. Welcome Trish from Gale. Let's break open this Gospel passage.
Well, this is one of the weeks when the person who had been going to do the background couldn't do it. And my heart sank when I saw the reading that I was going to be landed with, because I think it's my least favourite parable. But let's see what we can do with it. So first up, I think it's best to not sweat the detail in this parable, or any parable, really. There is one meaning, which is blatantly obvious because Jesus spells it out, be ready. But the setup described by the parable doesn't fit anything we know for sure about weddings in the time of Jesus. So we have to be careful building too much on individual elements of it. It's possible that this was a normal scenario that we just don't know about. It's also possible that it describes a completely outlandish scene, because Jesus does both those sorts of things in parables. So the reason it might be outlandish, it is odd to have a bunch of young girls aged probably between 12 and 14 waiting out all night by themselves and waiting for the groom rather than palling up with the bride. And next, we don't actually know what the lamps were. They were possibly oil-saturated cloth wrapped around poles, but that doesn't seem to be what's being pictured here. Possibly the sort of lamps that hold oil, but they were generally used indoors and weren't really designed to be carried around in a parade because they would spill. And then what about the organized girls telling the disorganized girls to go off and find oil or buy oil at midnight? Where from? And that last one's a good example of why we do need to be careful, because if we're looking at this and we decide, well, we're going to focus on that part of the parable, and we decide confidently that there clearly were oil selling places that functioned 24/7 in the first century, then the organized girls sending off the disorganized ones was their way of being kind. You know, they could have got back in time. However, if there really wasn't any hope of them getting oil, then the organized ones are essentially getting rid of the disorganized ones so that they don't have to share their oil. So two very different angles. And if we started off too confidently with one interpretation, we could build a lot on it, and we may be totally wrong. So that's one illustration, but could be applied to a lot of things within that parable. So what can we say with confidence? Jesus is giving his disciples a really solid dose of one message in the whole of this chapter and the chapter before. Be ready. Don't get complacent. The whole chapter before, he talks about being alert in the way we would be if we knew a thief was planning to break in, to keep our eyes open to the signs, to resist the temptation to bash each other because we don't think God's going to notice, to make the most of everything God gives us before time runs out. So it's urgent. Jesus is almost at the cross and wants to convey the urgency of all this. Be ready for anything.
Well, I thought for a moment, Anne, you were going to leave us in a labyrinth of confusion, but I don't think you have. But let's see where we go. Trish, talk to me about where you find challenge in the passage.
Oh, gosh. Well, the first thing was not my irritation, but the immediate, kind of like the betrayal, really, of the wise girls who have the oil and they're not prepared to share. And I'm thinking we have this gospel imperative about sharing. And right away, there's, no, we've got ourselves organised and you haven't. So that annoyed me. And then the injustice of the bridesmaids being turned out. And I'm thinking, aren't we about inclusivity? So, yeah, I agree. It's about preparation. But the real challenge for me in this is to ask myself, what kind of bridesmaid am I? Am I prepared for anything, that life is unexpected? Or do I just think life is going to be straightforward? And I don't need to prepare. I don't need to think in terms of a long journey rather than a short journey. So I think for me, it's a bit confronting about, have I come prepared? Or if I am prepared, how am I prepared? So that's the challenge for me.
Excellent. Okay, you've taken us into the heart of that, and that's probably going to resonate with all of us as we read this. Jonathan, do you look for challenges here?
Well, yeah. I thought there's no second chance here. You know, it's a bit harsh. This being, but he replied, truly, I tell you, I do not know you. But I've kind of found a way through that by imagining myself as a bridesmaid. When I'm that casual about my duty as a bridesmaid, so as not to notice that at least 5 others have flasks of oil with their lamps, that might have been the opportunity for me to do something about it. And if what identifies me as a bridesmaid is my burning lamp, then it's likely that I wouldn't be recognized. And, the rejection is understandable, I thought. I have to remind myself at that point that this is a parable, an artifice. It's not a crime scene investigation. I was terribly making it altogether personal. The important thing is that there's light for the wedding, not my inclusion. That's the tack I've taken. So the one challenge I picked up is explained away for me.
Thank you. I'm almost tempted to say you leave us in a bit of darkness there, but that's good.
Well, I have. When I went through it, I kept saying bride and gloom. So
glooms, yes, that's a kind of psychological slip. And you've given us a lot of challenge, but there may be something else you want to add.
Well, I think the challenge is that this is a really dangerous parable, and I think we have to be so careful with it. And we're given it on a Sunday to give to everybody, and yet it's actually only aimed at the complacent. So if we're complacent, we do need to hear it, but it's not for those who are already unsure about themselves, or those who are absolutely doing their best and keep failing. Yeah. I remember Adrian Plass. So I remember years ago, hearing him talk, and he was describing the scene where Jesus is haranguing the Pharisees, woe to you, Pharisees. And a little man tugs the back of his shirt, and Jesus turns around and he says, I don't think I'm going to make it. And Jesus whispers to him, don't worry, it's them I'm talking to, not you. I'm just thinking, so we actually need to be aware that Jesus didn't say the same thing to everyone, and therefore not every bit of the Bible is for all people all the time. But then I suppose there's a spin-off challenge that we can't use that as an excuse if it really should apply to us.
Well, I was just going to say that's a lovely word of hope, but thanks. Gee, you just sort of put out another warning.
It was a challenge.
It was another challenge. All right, well, that's all right. None of you have given us a hint of any good news that's yet to come. So I'll go with you, Trish, and hope that you can begin to bring some good news here.
I think one of the other challenges, I'm just going to loop back and say, I think the other challenge was to try and get some sense of hopefulness in this. I was reading one of the commentaries, and the woman there was quoting this gospel spiritual about, the song, keep your lamps trimmed and burning. You all know that song, keep your lamps trimmed all the way. The chorus is not about the end times, but about how do we maintain our hopefulness and our engagement during the meantime, while we're waiting. Good news that I see is that it's about how do we deal with life that is complex, frustrating, uncertain. We've already waited 2,000 years for Jesus. We're going to wait another 2,000 years. How do we do that? Metaphorical terms, it's about how do we refuel? How do we keep the supply of oil? How do we keep the lamps burning? What do we do? An illustration for me was we've just had COVID. Now, I've had COVID before. I've had an experience of it, but this time was different. And I'm thinking, well, you can't apply what you learned last time to this time because this is a different experience. And all of us are facing significant, internationally with the wars, personally, domestically. How do we attend to our refueling?
You're drawing very much that there is a sense of hope, or at least there's hope that there's hope. So I think I'm hearing it quite clearly emerging. So Anne, do you draw a similar or different, perhaps, good news here?
A bit. As a teenager, as you know, Mike, the closest I ever came to giving up my faith was when I got caught up in a wave of teachings about being left behind, that whole left behind thing. And so the image here of a closed door and me locked outside is my most foundational nightmare. So my good news coming to that is that we can never take this story out of the much wider context. So keep in mind that the previous parable was about a thief. Jesus isn't a thief. And I don't believe he's the door slamming bridegroom here either. It just doesn't fit with everything else we know of him. Jesus is the one who stands at the door and knocks, not the one who stands in our faces. Jesus is the one who continues to work at the Pharisees, trying to make them see sense, right, even when they're persecuting, even when they're putting him to death. He's the one who prays for forgiveness for those who've killed him, who forgives the thief on the cross next to him. So yes, we have to be careful not to be complacent and lazy, but not because of a potential slammed door, because the goodness of the news of God's love and faithfulness is new every morning, and we don't want to miss it.
So I'm hearing there, drawing in from another source, but that sense of Jesus standing at the door knocking, Revelation, very powerful as a key here as well. So let's hold on to that. Let's hear from you, Jonathan, where you unpacked some good news.
Yes, well, listening to everyone else, I've sort of changed what I was going to say, but I like some of the good news is that we get a good message. Be ready, keep awake. And the other bit of good news, going back to the kind of approach I took earlier, was that there's a banquet. There's a couple getting married, and the whole community rejoices. As an individual bridesmaid, am I that important? Not really. I then went on, and this is partially something that Trish was referring to. It's a learning opportunity. I was good enough to be selected. So what can I learn about finishing well? In fact, I might not be called to be a bridesmaid, and again, Anne was, saying that might not actually apply to me. So I was desperately looking for some good news there, but I think I've found some.
Apply this, Trish, for me in day-to-day life. Where would you find a so what in this quite torrid tale?
Well, the question that I started with was, what kind of bridesmaid am I? And the subset of that is then, how am I keeping my lamp trimmed and burning in an ongoing way? So is the invitation for me. So I think the so what is to pay attention to, how alert am I? How am I alert? That's not too complicated. And where is the invitation? And the place I came to with this was contemplative prayer as a spiritual discipline. And that might sound a non sequitur, but actually contemplative prayer for me is a kind of go-to place, 20 minutes of being centered on where Jesus is. And the more you begin to notice, the more like you become. And I'm thinking, it's not that prayer that is my trimming my lamp makes the external events in my life different, but it does change me. And it changes my ability to hear and listen and see. It gifts sometimes me with insight, and I think differently, and I ask different kinds of questions. So that's all refueling for me. Yeah, so that's the direction I took. It might not be everybody's cup of tea.
Absolutely, and that's the way it should be. That so you're leading us back into the heart of prayer, which I find a really helpful reminder. Jonathan, for you, application and so what?
I thought it was all about the privilege of embracing vocation. And I'm going to diverge slightly here by way of illustration. If anyone fell asleep on the job, it was Samson, and he ended up, in the words of Aldous Huxley's book, in the title of his book, Eyeless in Gaza. And the much vaunted Israeli security services fell asleep on the job, and a number of Israelis ended up in a worse state in Gaza. So remaining alert, it really does come across to me as a message, a strong message. So where I'm called to a role of serving God, where I have, in addition, the opportunity of equipping myself for my calling, rather than fall asleep, I should take that seriously. And if my job is to shed light, I need to ensure that I have the wherewithal to do just that. So whatever remaining topped up with light-producing fuel means for my vocation, that should be my first concern. That's what I took away. Nothing quite, I didn't get into the how, which you did helpfully, Trish, but I just sort of identified what the issue for me was.
Thank you for that. And there's a kind of humility in that approach of understanding that we're not to parade our self-importance, which we heard last week in the phylactery reference. And now you're just really emphasizing that keep alert. We all need to hear. And a final word.
Well, similar lines, I think the point is, what can we do to keep ourselves awake, keep ourselves alert, not for our salvation, but because what greater joy can there be than an ever-growing awareness of God and of God's gifts and of the promise of God coming? So that's kind of why we need each other, because we keep each other awake. It's why we need the church, however flawed it is, to keep us alert, to keep us faithful. We need to keep applying our minds as well as our hearts and our energies, realizing that there is no end to the unfathomable riches of what we can explore of God. So don't let's stagnate into complacency, but set out on a daily or an hourly adventure with God.
Indeed. Thank you all for exploring this quite difficult, sometimes almost unpleasant little parable and making out of it a great sense of expectation and beauty. And Trish, Jonathan, thank you.